Well, thank you very much. I am glad that when I got the advertisement for this, it said that I was going to be talking about the status quo because I am going to talk to you not about the incredibly cool project that Byron has and agrivoltaics, but kind of the typical project, I would say, that's out there. And I want to start out by I'm saying this apologetically. I should confess that my PhD is in farmland preservation. So I care deeply about farmers. And you'll see this. I'm going to talk about this before I talk about renewable energy ordinances a little bit. So just bear with me, because I think one of the things that I do is help communities understand what developers want to be doing, to Byron's point, what the utility models are pushing them towards, how they can ask for more, how communities can ask for more, but also not promising them things that they may not get right now. So, all right, that was my confession. Thank you for letting me do the catharsis there with you. Thank you also for having me. So one of the things that's really tricky about solar, I think, and also a huge opportunity, is that it can come in all different sizes. The same company that to the outside world, right? Like, these panels look more or less the same, whether they're sized for a single home, maybe on the roof of the garage, or maybe in the backyard, or whether they're sized for as a small, what I'm going to call solar farm. That word can be problematic sometimes. Here, I just want to point out that this is on a capped landfill where they're not allowed to put the drive piles into the ground. And so instead they're on ballasts here, sitting on top of that landfill. Or if they are in large solar farms, and this is not even the largest. This is a solar farm in Michigan that is only 50 megawatts. It's over 250 acres. So to the outside people, it's the same thing, just at various scales. But in fact, it's different companies that kind of operate in the different places and in different, specialize in the different scale of the technology. In terms of kind of what this landscape looks like in Michigan, and I would also say that I can speak for much of the Midwest. In terms of what is currently built, on average, our solar farms are 11 megawatts. That's actually masking that we have a bunch of things that are like 1 or 2 megawatts, and a couple of projects that are, as you can see, the biggest project right now in Michigan is 239 megawatts. To put that in scale, in case you don't kind of know the translation, and I was happy that my numbers are similar to what Byron just shared. For this kind of development, we would consider between 5 and 10 acres per megawatt. So on average, the projects currently built are between 50 and 100, call it, acres. The largest one in my state right now is 1,900 acres. But what is coming is significantly larger. On average, 160 megawatts is what's coming. There are a couple of projects that right now developers are proposing here that are 500 megawatts. And in fact, that's the biggest that is showing up, but there is one specific locality in Michigan that has 2 substations, electrical substations. Each of them are proposing to have a 500 megawatt system hooked up. So in that one place, it's 36 square miles, 8,000 acres are for these 2 collective wind farms, or solar farms, sorry. And that's not even the biggest in the Midwest. The project actually from California that was shown, it will be when it's called the Mammoth Solar Farm in Indiana is built. It will be the largest. It's 1.2 gigawatts, 13,000 acres. I don't develop, I just report what the developers are doing, just to be clear here. When I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. When I go to communities, and talk about what they should be considering as they're thinking about their land use plans and then translating that into zoning, which we'll get to in a little bit. I like to talk to them about what the local benefits and local concerns are. And again, I'm going to say, and what I often say is, I'm thinking about utility scale solar as is commonly practiced. This is non-agrivoltaics. This is not rooftop solar. The kind of pros and cons are different for that. But for a moment, we're going to talk about this site as a site of energy production. In terms of the local benefits, many of them are economic. So for the person who hosts solar panels on their property, there is a payment. Sometimes that is a kind of an annual payment, and very often it's quite lucrative. You can make in my part of the Midwest, you can make a whole lot more money leasing your land to a solar developer than you can leasing it to another farmer. In terms of scale, kind of the going rate to rent an acre of land. And actually, I've done studies across the 6 Great Lakes states. Kind of the going rate is between $800 and $1,200 per acre per year. Land, if you're going to rent it to another farmer to farm because you're not farming, if you're lucky, it would be in kind of the $200 per acre year, but very often it's about $150, $125. So $125 per acre to farm it, or $1,100 per acre to have it go in solar. Like, it's for the landowner, often it's kind of a no-brainer situation. Sometimes the land is not leased though. Sometimes it is purchased by solar developers. And actually that's happening more than anybody really thought it was happening once we kind of pulled together who's paying the tax bill or who owns that land. Sometimes for these big solar farms, neighbors are compensated as well. And this is one of the reasons that this happens is that it's very common for wind farms, but for solar farms, if you are surrounded, if you have a small acreage kind of place, and you are surrounded on 3 sides and across the street with solar panels, often that can be upsetting to you. And so this is one way to kind of make the peace, is these neighbor payments, but it is not all developers are practicing that. The other key economic benefit would be property taxes that are paid by the developer. Every state is different and it's complicated in how, like, what the tax situation is. But very often there is a higher tax rate for kind of the equipment that comes along with solar development compared to kind of agricultural activity. And so that can either mean that the local government has more money to spend on local government services, or in some states, the amount of money that the government receives doesn't get bigger, but everybody else who's a taxpayer doesn't pay quite as much taxes. And so again, kind of different situation, but very often large solar farms are taxpayers. I'm glad that Byron talked about the jobs, because I give people on these large solar farms a jobs caveat. There's lots of jobs during construction for a 2,000 acre solar farm. But even this biggest solar farm in Michigan, there is one person that is like there 4 days a week. There's, a crew comes and mows the grass a couple of times a year, but effectively one technician. And so there's not tons of long-term jobs if they're designed only as sites of energy production. There's a lot of work that comes out that NREL is doing, and that Byron's involved in too, a lot of research on the water quality benefits and the ecosystem benefits that can come along with solar. But I would say that really depends on the site design and what you're planting underneath and around the solar panels. I think it's also important to note that, like, whether it's an improvement depends on how the land was previously used. Not all agriculture is dirty or clean, like depending on what you think about agriculture as like the ecological benefits. And so I think it's hard to have a like paint broad brush strokes, but some kind of what these benefits are, it really depends. It depends both on the solar design and kind of what was happening there too. And as I mentioned, and you'll see dual use again and again, where Byron and I are on the same page. Like, this is an opportunity for brownfield reuse. Even at the large scale, there are some sites that were previously industrial activity or previously disturbed sites. But honestly, at the couple thousand acre scale, you don't see many of them. So sites where you are really kind of reusing brownfields tend to be on the smaller end of utility scale solar development. So that's local benefits. In terms of the local concerns, I think some of what's brought up is wildlife concerns. And I would suggest to people that this is a construction activity. And so just like any construction activity, there is going to be wildlife disturbance so long as critters have places to go during that disturbance and come back, that they can come back to, they should return. And during that operations phase, actually, in many situations, there's less chasing animals away than there was previously. Like, you can create habitat along with your solar farm. There are wildlife friendly fences that allow small things to get in through the holes. This may be different in different parts of the country, but in Michigan and kind of the Midwest, we really like our deer. And for a large solar farm, the National Electric Code and by large, I would say above 5 megawatts, the National Electric Code requires a fence around the solar farm that's either 6 feet tall with 3 strands of barbed wire, which I gotta say does not fit in the rural aesthetic very often, the barbed wire part. Or you can have a taller fence. You can have a 7-foot fence. 7 feet is still not tall. Like, deer can still jump over a 7-foot fence. And right now, here we're having some issues where deer are becoming entrapped inside a solar farm. And you can't really herd them out of the gate. Like, you can't just open the gate and hope that they go out. And it's problematic in the state of Michigan because deer are considered a public resource, and you're not allowed to entrap deer. And so, kind of thinking that through is really an important kind of consideration. Another local concern that I think drives a whole lot of reactions. A lot of my work is trying to understand people's reactions to solar farms and wind farms too, is associated with the visual impacts. I have some work specifically on wind that finds in places where people are there for productive reasons. So where there are lots of farmers, or where there is kind of I don't want to say maybe extractive type of industries, where the land is a working landscape. Wind is another way to make money off of that landscape. Where people are in a place for aesthetic reasons, wind turbines are a change to that landscape. And I would say the same is true for solar panels. And you would think that, like, solar panels, even elevated so that cattle can graze, are not that tall. And that is absolutely true. They're not nearly as tall as a 500 or 600 foot tall wind turbine. But one of the challenges is when you have it at this scale that I'm talking about, right? And you're seeing the solar farm for miles and miles, like, it certainly has impacts on the people that are surrounded. And often it can become a big part of the landscape. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see differences. Honestly, there's also concern by neighbors often of what this will do to their property values. And so that's particularly true when they believe that, when they bought their house because of the view out of the back porch or what was being farmed next door. And there is now some research kind of looking at that's mixed and complicated. And it effectively finds that sometimes, maybe in places of scarcity, actually, back, Mona, to what you were saying, when it is the last field or the last woodlot that is developed in solar, that becomes solar. So kind of on the suburban fringe, there's some research out of Rhode Island that says that may have an impact on nearby property values. There's the collaborators that I work with at the National Renewable, or not NREL, sorry, at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, just came out with a 6-state study and finds like it depends on scale. Smaller solar farms, they found absolutely no impact. For larger solar farms, then in some states it makes a difference, but they're not actually finding reduction in property values. Anyway, this is something where like the research is underway right now. And I'm going to keep that in your mind, because I'm going to end with that. Like, what do we do with new technologies? Finally, a big one that I think about a lot and that we hear a lot is this a wise use of land? Is solar only, energy only, a wise use of the land? And particularly when we're talking about it on farmland, there is very different views, even in the same, Washington Post. I could talk for too long about this, so I'm not. I'm just going to say, first of all, when people say farmland preservation, which is what I study, they mean different things. Sometimes planners often are talking about preserving an urban boundary and keeping development in cities, so you don't have to extend urban services. And solar can do that. Like, you can't develop a subdivision on land that already is occupied by solar panels. Very often, farmland preservation programs are funded by folks who want to preserve a rural vista, which is not always the same, which sometimes is the same as habitat, but not necessarily. And sometimes is not compatible with farmer livelihoods or actually growing food. Some folks who are really into farmland preservation don't necessarily think about the farmer that has to make a living, right? And so these last two, I think, are the trickiest ones, and I'm happy to talk more about some ongoing research that we have on this. Okay, but to the purpose of talking about zoning and planning, I would say I'm a planner. Your zoning should be based on a plan. So I think it's really important to think about how renewable energy fits with long-term plans. It is a land use, yes, that can take up space. So you need to think about what your land use plan is, but also what is your plan for local economic development? Because I would suggest that renewable energy can provide a huge economic opportunity to rural places. Also, depending on the persuasion of your location, like, this may be your opportunity for climate action. In many of the communities that I work in, that is not a motivator, but in some it is. And amongst this group, I thought I would bring it up. The second thing that you should think about in your planning is what sort of renewable energy, at which scale, and in which part of your community. So I would say wind and solar play differently in terms of their impacts on land use and kind of the how they factor into being able to still farm the land. Again, agrivoltaics aside. I would also say that on-site use renewables are typically uncontroversial, but in some places there are kind of unreasonable requirements put there. And then I think also in that conversation, you ought to think about what sort of co-benefits you want to see in terms of community payments or ownership stake in the project, access to the site, public access to the site, and habitat or dual use. Like, under what terms does it make sense for your community to host energy infrastructure? And then the next step is to make your zoning match your plan. Specifics matter. Like, the actual whether or not it's allowed in the zone that where you are imagining the solar farm to go matters. I would suggest to communities you are unlikely to satisfy everyone, especially when we're talking about renewables at a very large scale. I would also tell them that sometimes people want to like average setback distances of what the people who want the solar farm and the people who don't want the solar farm want. That's going to satisfy no one. Like, you have to be thinking about what is where does it fit? But I also would suggest it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You don't have to say no to everything, but you also don't have to open up the entirety of your community in your zoning for renewables. I think that what's really important in your zoning is that you make sure that you write down the things that you care about, so that no matter what developer comes in the door, you're getting the things that you care about. In Michigan, we have a sample ordinance. I have it printed out. Oh no, it's being eaten by the background. Whatever. I got it in hard copy too. That we put together with Michigan State Extension, and the first half of it is kind of what communities ought to know about solar, and the second half of it is a fill in the blank zoning template. We don't fill in the blank. We effectively say, very often we say, well, how you fill in the blank should depend on what kind of setback distances you have for other land uses. Like I'm pretty adamant that we don't pick on solar unnecessarily. And so kind of being consistent with how you treat other land uses is important. It covers the normal things like setbacks and noise and ground cover. And importantly though, sometimes we don't want it to be dirt. We want it to be soil, right? Underneath the panels. Sometimes people will suggest a ground cover requirement because they want there to be life underneath the panels, but a perennial ground cover requirement may mean that you can't do agrivoltaics. And so anyway, I'm really proud of the ground cover requirements that are in here. So you might want to check those out. It requires the developer to, at the very minimum, have some ecological value to what they're putting in there, but kind of allowing for grazing, allowing for pollinator habitat, and allowing actually for agrivoltaics. So, and then it's really important that that zoning or kind of the land use plans include decommissioning provisions, not just the provisions itself to make sure that the equipment gets taken down so it's not rusting on the landscape, but also that there's a financial guarantee and that we periodically review this, in part thinking about recycling, kind of going back to what Gary was talking about, like for the end of its life. Like we don't know what the market for used solar panels is going to be right now. They may be there for 35 years. It's hard to imagine what the future is. And so making sure that you're periodically reviewing kind of how much money you have available. I got 3 more slides, I think, that are more philosophical, I would suggest. One is some real talk about community benefits. For the planners among you, if you haven't read it, read Neighborhood Defenders. There is 0 mention of energy in Neighborhood Defenders, but it is all about housing in Metro Boston. And the point that it makes is that many stipulations that we require in zoning for anything come at a cost, especially a cost to development, especially when added after the fact. And that lots of well-intended stipulations effectively have the impact of pricing a project out. I think what's really important in the kind of renewable space is that we're trying to find a balance of what's reasonable. And I would suggest that community members are often at a disadvantage here because they don't have any idea what the project can handle. There's, especially now with federal tax credits, there is a lot of money in renewable energy development. I don't think it is being shared necessarily with the community, but it's difficult, but we don't know. And I would also say that different scales of projects in different locations have different amounts of profit in there, that some of which ought to be shared with the community. But I think that, again, this information asymmetry is tricky. I also want to put this, I took in my class a lot about energy justice. And on the one hand here, slow deployment of renewables is perpetuating fossil fuel burning and the injustices that come along with that. And I want to acknowledge that the bads of renewables are not nearly as dire as the bads of fossil fuels. On the other hand, my students have taught me this. There should be no green halos for renewables. Like every energy source has local impacts and impacts along the supply chain, right? And so like we need to think about that whole, the entire supply chain. And we don't want to just be swapping one injustice that has come with fossil fuel development for another. So very often in the space of energy justice, we think about distributional justice and the importance of communities having ownership in a project. That is rarely on the table for many utility scale projects. Like They are not planning to have this be community owned. And in some states, there is no requirement forcing kind of community ownership stake. Also, like, there are few local jobs, and so few direct benefits. I should also mention that particularly when we're talking about a large scale, it is very often the largest landowners in a community who have the space, who have the thousands of acres, who will benefit the most. And often it is their neighbors who are upset about it. And sometimes their neighbors are like vacation homeowners, and maybe we feel differently about their opposition than when these are people who used to own that land and had to sell it off to somebody else. And so it's tricky. If you haven't read it, I really recommend Revolutionary Power by Dr. Shalonda Baker. She's currently at the Department of Energy, and she heads up their energy justice work. But in it, she talks about climate fundamentalism, which is a narrow focus on advancing climate and energy policy while failing to account for justice concerns or deliberately delaying justice concerns. This is the idea that clean energy can replicate and reinforce structural inequality. And if we don't change utility business models, like, it's just perpetuating that. And let's not let urgency to address climate change mask the fact that, like, there are justice considerations. This is my last slide. Okay. So in terms of the next frontier, I think the things that make this complicated and fun and amazing, and why it's great that there are so many students interested in this, is we really need to think about how we're navigating trade-offs, about who gets to choose what happens in communities. Is it kind of a technocratic version of planning where we determine what are the best places for wind and solar and say, this is where they shall be? Or is it a participatory planning process? Similarly, how do we tease out just versus unjust opposition? How do we navigate the trade-offs? Like, should there be some landscapes that are entirely off limits? How do we put climate change and addressing that in perspective of the other goals that we have? There are local burdens, or there can be local burdens. Like, but global benefits. So how do you weigh that? I think my suggestion to both of these things is that policies that help get communities to yes on their own terms, that help them imagine their futures and what they want to see, is the way that we do this justly. But there's a lot of efforts right now to effectively say, no, there is an urgent problem and we just need to take renewable energy in whatever form it can come to our community. Finally, the thing that I would leave you with, especially as we're thinking about lithium and other new technologies, is how do we handle new technologies? What do we do? How do we set land use policies in the face of uncertainty and unknown risks? Right now, we can go to communities and talk about what we know happens, and the research that's happening on Byron's farm, right, is helping us understand, like, what can grow underneath solar panels, like what are the ecological benefits. But for a brand new technology, we may not have that. And so kind of how do we think about that, and how do we adapt for the future? Okay, thanks.